At 73, Dorothy had always prided herself on her morning routine. Every day at exactly 7:15 a.m., she would shuffle in her sunlit kitchen, her slippers making that familiar soft whisper against the hardwood floors her late husband Harold had installed 40 years ago. The ritual was sacred: 2 scoops of old-fashioned oats, a splash of milk, and whatever fruit happened to be ripening in her bowl on the counter. "Breakfast is the foundation of a good day," she would often tell her daughter Susan during their weekly phone calls. It was one of those pieces of wisdom that came naturally after decades of life, after 60, when you finally understand that the simple things matter most. Dorothy's oatmeal wasn't just food. It was comfort, consistency, and a gentle way to honor the body that had carried her through 7 decades of joys and sorrows. But last Tuesday morning, something felt different. As Dorothy stirred her usual combination of oats, sliced banana, and a spoonful of her favorite Greek yogurt, she noticed her hands trembling slightly. Not the gentle shake that sometimes comes with age, but something more unsettling. By the time she'd finished her bowl, a strange fatigue had settled over her like a heavy blanket. "Just one of those days," she whispered to herself, though deep down, her emotional wisdom was sending up quiet warning signals. After raising 4 children and caring for Harold through his final illness, Dorothy had learned to trust her instincts about her own well-being. The episodes continued throughout the week. Each morning brought the same routine, the same beloved oatmeal combinations she'd been enjoying for years, and each day brought that same mysterious exhaustion. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chun, noticed Dorothy moving more slowly during their evening walks around the block. "You seem tired lately, dear," Mrs. Chun observed with the gentle concern that comes from a lifetime of caring for others. "Are you feeling all right?" Dorothy wanted to brush off the worry, to maintain that spirit of senior empowerment that had always defined her approach to aging. She'd worked hard to maintain her independent living after Harold passed, turning what could have been a lonely chapter into something meaningful and purposeful. She volunteered at the community center, tended her small garden, and had even started taking watercolor classes at the local senior center. But this fatigue was different. It wasn't the natural tiredness that comes from a full, active life. It was something that seemed to drain her energy from the inside out, leaving her feeling disconnected from the vibrant woman she'd worked so hard to remain. The breakthrough came during her monthly appointment with Dr. Martinez, her physician for the past 15 years. As they discussed her symptoms, Dorothy mentioned her breakfast routine in passing, thinking it was hardly worth noting. "Tell me exactly what you've been eating," Dr. Martinez said, leaning forward with sudden interest. Every detail matters. As Dorothy recounted her morning combinations, the yogurt, the fresh fruit, the occasional nuts and seeds she'd add for extra nutrition, she watched her doctor's expression change. What she saw there wasn't alarm exactly, but a recognition that made her stomach tighten with unexpected anxiety. "Dorothy," Dr. Martinez said gently, "I think we need to talk about something that might surprise you. What you're describing, it's more common than you might think, especially for people our age." Dorothy's hands found each other in her lap, the same way they had during countless moments of uncertainty throughout her life. Whatever came next, she knew her world was about to shift in ways she never could have imagined. The waiting room felt different on the drive home. Dorothy stared out the passenger window as her daughter, Susan, navigated the familiar streets, her mind drifting back to the conversation that had just turned her understanding upside down. Dr. Martinez's words echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the foods we think are helping us can actually work against us, especially as our bodies change with age." It was hard to accept that something as innocent as oatmeal, her comfort food, her daily anchor, could be causing harm. But then again, life after retirement had been full of these small revelations. Things she'd taken for granted suddenly required new attention, new awareness. "Mom, you're being quiet," Susan said, glancing over with the same worried expression she'd worn as a child when Dorothy was upset. "Are you okay?" Dorothy managed a small smile. The truth was, she'd been doing a lot of senior reflection lately, even before this medical mystery began. At 73, she found herself looking back more often, not with regret exactly, but with a deeper understanding of how the pieces of her life had fit together. Harold's death 3 years ago had forced her into a version of herself she'd never expected to meet. For 48 years of marriage, she'd been part of a team. Harold handled the finances, she managed the household. He fixed things that broke, she maintained the social connections. When he was gone, Dorothy had to learn who she was as just Dorothy, not Dorothy and Harold. The early months had been the hardest. Well-meaning friends would invite her to dinner parties where she felt like a puzzle piece that no longer fit anywhere. Church gatherings became exercises in awkward sympathy. Even grocery shopping felt strange when she only needed to buy food for one. But somewhere in that difficult period, Dorothy had discovered something unexpected about herself. She had more strength than she'd realized. The emotional resilience that had carried her through raising 4 children, managing Harold's long illness, and all the smaller crises of family life. It was still there, maybe even stronger now. Finding purpose became her quiet mission. She started volunteering at the Literacy Center, helping adults learn to read. There was something powerful about watching someone's face light up when letters finally became words. Words became sentences. It reminded her that learning never stops, that growth doesn't have an expiration date. The watercolor classes had been Susan's idea, but Dorothy had embraced them with surprising enthusiasm. Her hands, which had spent decades cooking, cleaning, and caring for others, discovered they could create something beautiful just for the joy of it. Her instructor, a gentle woman named Patricia, often said that painting was like meditation with color. Dorothy understood what she meant. These new activities had become the framework of her independent life. She'd learned to manage her own finances, tackle small home repairs with the help of YouTube videos, and even plan solo trips to visit old friends in other states. The confidence that came with each small victory had built into something she'd never expected, a sense of adventure. But now, sitting in Susan's car with this new information about her breakfast routine, Dorothy felt that familiar flutter of uncertainty. How many other things in her carefully constructed new life might need examining? How many assumptions about what was good for her body, her health, her future might need questioning? I keep thinking about what your father would say, Dorothy murmured, watching the trees blur past. He always joked that I could make anything complicated, even breakfast. Susan laughed softly. He'd probably say you're overthinking it. But Mom, if something's making you feel bad, we figured out. That's what we do. The simple certainty in her daughter's voice reminded Dorothy of something she'd almost forgotten in the worry of the past few weeks. She wasn't facing this alone. Over the next several days, Dorothy found herself caught between 2 worlds. Dr. Martinez had given her a detailed list of food combinations to avoid, and suddenly her kitchen felt like a minefield. The banana she'd been adding to her oatmeal for years? Apparently, it could interfere with certain medications she'd started taking for her blood pressure. The walnuts she sprinkled on top for heart health? They might be creating an absorption problem with her vitamin supplements. Even the innocent Greek yogurt she'd thought was the perfect healthy addition was potentially causing issues when combined with her morning oats and the calcium supplement her doctor had recommended after her last bone density scan. The revelation had shaken something deeper than just her breakfast routine. Dorothy sat at her kitchen table one morning, staring at the empty bowl in front of her, paralyzed by choices that had once been automatic. This was supposed to be her time of wisdom, her season of aging with dignity built on decades of experience. Yet here she was second-guessing decisions as basic as what to eat. Susan had offered to help, of course. She'd even suggested they meal prep together on weekends, making sure Dorothy had safe, nutritious options ready throughout the week. But something about the offer made Dorothy bristle in a way that surprised her. She'd worked so hard to maintain her independence, to prove to herself and everyone else that she could handle late-life choices with grace and competence. The idea of needing supervision for something as fundamental as feeding herself felt like a step backward she wasn't ready to take. The family dynamics that had seemed so settled just weeks ago were shifting in ways Dorothy hadn't anticipated. Susan's increased attention, while loving, felt suffocating. Her son Michael had started calling more frequently. asking pointed questions about her energy levels and whether she was taking care of herself properly. Even her youngest, Rebecca, had mentioned during their last video call that maybe it was time to consider some additional support around the house. Dorothy could read between the lines. The unspoken conversation humming beneath all these caring check-ins was about her ability to live independently. One episode of fatigue, one medical mystery, and suddenly the life she'd carefully rebuilt was being questioned by the very people who claimed to want what was best for her. The breaking point came during a family dinner at Susan's house the following Sunday. Dorothy had been picking at her food, hyper-aware of every bite, wondering what combinations might be causing problems she couldn't even detect. The conversation flowed around her, grandchildren's activities, work stress, weekend plans, while she felt increasingly isolated by her new dietary restrictions and the constant mental calculations they required. Then Michael, well-meaning as always, made the suggestion that changed everything. "Mom, Susan and I have been talking. What if you moved into that nice senior community near the hospital? They have meal programs, and you wouldn't have to worry about any of this food stuff anymore. Plus, there would be people around if you needed anything." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken expectations. Dorothy looked around the table at her children's faces, seeing love and concern, but also a decision that seemed to have been made without her input. These were the people who had watched her transform from a dependent widow into someone who traveled solo, learned new skills, and built a meaningful life on her own terms. Yet here they were, ready to package her back into a version of safety that felt more like surrender. The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders. This wasn't just about oatmeal or food combinations anymore. This was about whether the independence she'd fought so hard to claim was something she could truly keep, or if caring families and aging bodies would eventually make that choice for her. Dorothy's hands found each other again, the way they always did when life demanded more wisdom than she felt she possessed. The words she spoke next would determine not just where she lived, but who she remained in the years ahead. Before Dorothy could respond to Michael's suggestion, her phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the heavy silence at the dinner table, and Dorothy glanced at the screen with surprise. It was Patricia, her watercolor instructor, calling on a Sunday evening. Dorothy almost declined the call, but something in her gut told her to answer. "Dorothy, dear, I hope I'm not interrupting." Patricia's voice carried an unusual excitement. "But I had to call you immediately. Do you remember that landscape you painted last month? The one of the old oak tree by the pond?" Dorothy's mind shifted gears, grateful for the distraction from the conversation that had been closing in around her like walls. "Of course. You said it reminded you of something. Well, I entered in the regional art show without telling you. I hope you don't mind. And Dorothy, you won second place. But that's not even the incredible part. There's a gallery owner from the city who saw your work. She wants to feature your paintings in a show specifically highlighting artists who began their creative journey later in life. She's calling it Rediscovery After 60, and she thinks your work perfectly captures the spirit of new beginnings." The room went completely quiet. Dorothy's children stared at her with expressions ranging from confusion to amazement. Michael's mouth was actually hanging open slightly. Susan reached over and squeezed Dorothy's free hand. "A gallery show?" Dorothy managed to whisper into the phone. "Are you certain?" "More than certain. She wants to meet with you this Tuesday to discuss featuring 6 of your pieces." "Dorothy, this could be the beginning of something wonderful. I've seen this happen before. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives don't begin until we think the story is almost over." After Dorothy hung up, the silence stretched longer than seemed possible. Finally, Rebecca, joining the call from across the country, broke the quiet. "Mom, did I just hear correctly? You're going to be in an art gallery." The irony wasn't lost on Dorothy. Here she'd been sitting at this table feeling diminished, reduced to someone who couldn't even manage her breakfast safely, while miles away, strangers were celebrating her artistic vision. The timing felt like more than coincidence. It felt like a message from the universe, or maybe from Harold, reminding her of who she'd become rather than who she used to be. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "That's amazing, Mom, but it doesn't change the fact that you've been having health issues. Maybe this gallery thing could wait until you're feeling stronger, more settled. Something sparked in Dorothy's chest, a flame that had been dampened by weeks of worry and medical appointments. This wasn't just about a gallery show. This was about the narrative of her life, about who got to decide when her story was worth telling and when it was time to wrap it up safely. You know, Dorothy said slowly, her voice gaining strength with each word. 3 years ago, when your father died, every one of you was worried about me. You thought I'd fall apart, that I couldn't handle living alone, that I'd spend my days sitting in that house drowning in memories. Do you remember what I told you then? Her children nodded, though she could see they weren't sure where this was leading. I told you that grief doesn't mean giving up, that loving someone and losing them doesn't make you broken. It makes you someone who knows how precious time really is. Dorothy stood up from the table, feeling steadier than she had in weeks. This gallery opportunity, these food complications, even your concerns about my independence, they're all part of the same question. Do I have more living to do, or am I just trying to survive safely until the end? The weight of her words settled over the room. Outside, the evening light was fading, but inside, Dorothy felt something dawning that she hadn't experienced in months. The realization that healing family bonds sometimes meant standing your ground, not giving in to everyone else's version of what safety should look like. Susan was the first to speak, her voice softer than it had been all evening. Mom, I didn't know you felt like we were trying to manage your life. We're just scared. The admission hung in the air, raw and honest. Dorothy looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw something she'd been too caught up in her own defensive feelings to notice. Susan's face carried the same expression Dorothy remembered from childhood, when Susan would confess to breaking something valuable, waiting to see if love was stronger than disappointment. Scared of what, sweetheart? Dorothy asked, settling back into her chair. Of losing you the way we lost Dad, Michael said quietly. Of not being able to help when you need us. Of missing the signs that something's wrong. His voice cracked slightly. We still feel guilty about Dad, about not knowing how sick he really was until it was too late. The life's turning point after 60 that Dorothy had been wrestling with suddenly crystallized into something much clearer. This wasn't about Oatmeal or senior communities or even her independence. This was about a family still healing from loss, still learning how to love each other without the fear of another goodbye hanging over every conversation. Dorothy reached across the table and took both Susan's and Michael's hands. Your father spent his last 6 months teaching me something important. He said that protecting someone you love doesn't mean making all their choices for them. It means trusting them to make good choices and being there when they need support. She paused, feeling Harold's presence in the room as clearly as if he were sitting beside her. The morning he died, do you know what he said to me? He said, Dottie, don't let them turn you into someone you're not because they're afraid of losing you. Live like you mean it. The emotional closure Dorothy had been seeking wasn't about resolving her dietary restrictions or proving her independence. It was about helping her children understand that loving someone meant accepting both their strength and their vulnerability. That wisdom with age included knowing when to ask for help and when to assert your right to make your own mistakes. Here's what we're going to do, Dorothy continued, surprised by the clarity in her own voice. I'm going to work with Dr. Martinez to figure out these food combinations safely. I'm going to meet with that gallery owner on Tuesday and see where this art opportunity leads. And I'm going to stay in my house, cooking my own breakfast, making my own choices. She squeezed their hands tighter, but I'm also going to ask for help when I need it. I'm going to let you worry about me sometimes because that's what families do. And when the time comes that I truly can't manage on my own, I'll listen to your concerns. But that time isn't now. Rebecca's voice came through the phone with tears she was trying to hide. Mom, we just want you to be safe. Safe isn't the same as alive, Dorothy replied gently. And I'm not done being alive yet. The room fell quiet again, but this silence felt different. Peaceful instead of tense. Accepting instead of resistant. Susan wiped her eyes with her napkin. So you're really going to be in an art gallery? Dorothy laughed, the sound surprising all of them with its lightness. Apparently so. Who would have thought that learning to paint at 70 would lead to this? Dad would have been so proud, Michael said softly. He is proud, Dorothy corrected. Some love doesn't end with death. It just changes form. As the evening wound down and the conversation shifted to lighter topics, Dorothy felt something settle inside her chest. Not resignation, but resolution. The kind that comes when you stop fighting against your life and start embracing it, complications and all. Even her morning oatmeal would taste different now. Not like a problem to be solved, but like another small adventure in the ongoing story of becoming exactly who she was meant to be. 3 months later, Dorothy stood in the softly lit gallery space, watching strangers examine her paintings with genuine interest. The landscape that had started this unexpected journey, her oak tree by the pond, hung in the center of the wall, illuminated by professional lighting that made the colors seem to glow from within. She'd never imagined her work displayed this way, never dreamed that something she'd started as a hobby could touch other people's hearts. The artist is here tonight, she heard the gallery owner telling a couple who'd been studying her watercolor of Harold's old garden. Would you like to meet her? Dorothy smoothed her dress and walked over, no longer surprised by the confidence in her own steps. The couple, probably in their 50s, looked at her with the kind of respect she'd learned to accept gracefully. Your work has such depth, the woman said. There's something about the way you capture light that feels hopeful, I guess. Like you're painting what life could be, not just what it is. Dorothy smiled, thinking of all the mornings she'd spent at her kitchen table, working on these pieces while her oatmeal cooled in its bowl. She'd learned to navigate her dietary restrictions without feeling limited by them. Dr. Martinez had helped her understand that aging bodies sometimes needed different fuel, and that wisdom included adapting without surrendering joy. Her breakfast routine had become more thoughtful, more intentional, but no less satisfying. I think maybe hope is what we learn to see when we've lived long enough to know that difficult seasons don't last forever, Dorothy replied. These paintings come from understanding that life's quiet victories are often the most meaningful ones. The senior resilience she discovered in herself had surprised everyone, including Dorothy. The gallery show had led to 2 more exhibitions, and she'd even started teaching watercolor workshops at the community center. Her students, mostly women her age or older, often told her they'd never thought they could learn something new at this stage of life. Dorothy understood the feeling completely. Susan and Michael had become her biggest supporters, helping her set up a small studio in Harold's old workshop. The space that had once held his tools now housed her easels and paints, and somehow that felt like the most natural transition in the world. Timeless lessons about love, she'd learned, included understanding that life continues to unfold in ways we can't predict, and that the people we lose remain part of our story, even as we write new chapters. Her morning routine had evolved too. She still ate oatmeal most days, but now she varied her combinations based on what her body needed, what her doctor recommended, and what simply sounded appealing. The rigid fear that had once paralyzed her in the kitchen had been replaced by a gentle awareness that served her much better. The greatest change, though, was harder to put into words. Dorothy had learned to hold space for both vulnerability and strength, for both independence and interdependence. She discovered that asking her children for help when she needed it didn't diminish her autonomy. It actually strengthened the trust between them. When Susan offered to drive her to gallery events, or Michael helped her hang heavier paintings, Dorothy accepted their support with gratitude instead of resistance. Standing in that gallery, surrounded by her art and the quiet murmur of people finding meaning in her work, Dorothy felt Harold's presence as clearly as ever. Not as grief or longing, but as a gentle reminder that love transforms but never truly ends. Her life had become proof that the most beautiful chapters sometimes begin precisely when we think the story might be winding down. The woman studying her garden painting looked up again. There's something I have to ask. When did you start painting? At 70, Dorothy answered simply. I guess you could say it was never too late to discover what I didn't know I was capable of.